next time.
I am just down the road, Hannes.
Where are you?
I'm in Prague.
Why don't you look? Why don't you come by?
Well,
Just
I
have a
will.
look.
I will,
Yeah.
but I'm going to France tomorrow.
Okay. So this is okay. France is also nice, but Austria is maybe nicer. No, I'm not. This is a kind of nationalism I'm not going to repeat. Sorry, I have to excuse in front of everybody.
Am I allowed to go to Italy?
No, at the moment, Italy, they have very bad weather. Peter and Walter, you tell me when we can start. I think now.
Okay, let me just bring on the starting page, and then as soon as Walter gives me the okay, then I'm gonna start the music, and as soon as that is over, you can start.
So we start with a piece of music, and then I take over. Okay.
So that's exactly how we do it.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Walter, are we ready to go?
Yes. So this was our piece of innovation of today. We started with a piece of music. Thank you, Elizabeth, for proposing this piece of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the event of today. This is the last one before the summer break. And since this is the last one, allow me a very short review. In this summer term, we had 9 lectures already, and 1 public action where we had an open letter and public support action for the European AI Act. So it was quite a lot of work we did in these 5 months, especially since we thought of having 1 lecture per month only. So it was quite an active time. I want to thank all the speakers and also you who follow our lecture here. Nearly every second week now, and also special thanks to the team at TU Wien, which makes this possible. Without you, this would not be able, and this is a special thanks to TU Vienna. We will continue with our lecture series in fall. More details at the beginning of fall, but I also want already now point at the summer school. We have Digital Humanism Summer School in the first week of September, and application is now open. Today we have probably the currently hottest topic, given the current state of the world. We discuss autonomous weapon systems and possible ways to regulation. This will be discussed by a high-level panel with Elisabeth Hofberger-Pippern. She's coming from research, and Andreas Bilgeri is coming from politics. Thanks to both of you. And Mr. Bilgeri is replacing Caroline Wörgötter. She was planned initially, but she's unable to attend due to illness. We wish her all the best, but special thanks goes to Mr. Bilgeri for replacing her on very short notice. Thanks a lot. Moderation is done by Alison Stanger. She will also introduce the speakers. Alison, thank you. The choreography today, we had this innovation. We started with a piece of music, then we have the 2 speakers, each approximately 20-25 minutes. And then we have the discussion moderated by Alison. And at the end, we have again a piece of music. This time, I think it is proposed by Peter Knies. Thanks for that. Welcome, Alison. You are well known to our community, so I'm not going to introduce you at full length, but I thank you for being with us and for moderating the panel, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hannes. Well, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our two panelists today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Elisabeth Hofberger-Pippern, who is a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. That institute deals with emerging technologies and international law, artificial intelligence, and military robotics. Prior to joining the Research Institute in Frankfurt, she was head of the International Panel on the Regulation of Autonomous Weapons, which was a project funded by the German Foreign Office. Simultaneously, she was also an associate at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in the International Security Division. She obtained her PhD from the University of Linz with a dissertation on less lethal weapons under international law, which was subsequently published by Cambridge University Press. I think I'll go ahead and introduce both speakers, and then we'll proceed in turn. Our second speaker will be Andreas Bielgeri. He is a counselor and disarmament expert at the Permanent Mission of Austria in Geneva. He has multilateral experience from a diverse set of international organizations in the field of security and human rights, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as the Council of Europe and the United Nations. So he's a triple threat. During his previous posting in Strasbourg, he was involved in the Council of Europe's work toward the regulation of artificial intelligence with regard to human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. In Geneva, his work focuses on emerging technologies in the military domain. He regularly participates in the discussions of the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapons systems in Geneva, and was part of the team behind the successful adoption of a resolution on lethal autonomous weapon systems by the General Assembly in 2023, the distinguished list of accomplishments. So we're delighted to have the opportunity to learn from such distinguished speakers. So I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Hofberger-Pippern. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. I will now share my slides with you, and I do hope that it works. So the first usual question is, can everyone see my slides? If not, please raise your voice, but I think it should be fine now. So within the next couple of 20 to 25 minutes, I'm going to talk about autonomous weapon systems, the role artificial intelligence plays in this regard. And I will also take a bit of time to talk about humanitarian law, just to give you an overall overview of the technological side of things, and then also go on and give you like a very brief introduction into what international law has to say about autonomous weapon systems and artificial intelligence, respectively. Before starting my slides, I will just make a very brief disclaimer. I do not have a military background, so my entire research comes from my own research and the publications that I have done so far. But today we're going to discuss many things that are very relevant from a military perspective. But as I said, I don't have a military background. So if you know something better than I do, which might certainly be the case, please feel free to correct me or to address things that I have said in the Q&A session. You know that artificial intelligence is up and running in the media, so to say. So you've heard, of course, about Lavender and about Gospel. These are systems, mostly decision support systems, the Israeli Defense Forces are currently using in order to identify particular targets, and then those targets are neutralized. And we can talk about that, those specificities and in detail a bit later, but just that you know, of course, AI and also to a certain extent, the potential role of autonomous weapons is ubiquitous. And this is something that we need to be aware of and that we certainly need to be concerned about. So the first and most important aspect we need to take into consideration is what are autonomous weapon systems? And international law does not provide for an official definition of autonomous weapon systems, but we do have certain documents that we refer to, or the international community refers to as a, so to say, working definition of autonomous weapon systems. And the most important document has been provided by the International Committee of the Red Cross in 2016, according to which autonomous weapon systems are those weapon systems, or is any weapon system with autonomy in its critical functions that can select and attack targets without human intervention. And the definition by the ICRC is conceivably broad. And if you only take this terminology in order to define an autonomous weapon system, there are certain technologies out there, there are certain weapon systems out there which might arguably fall under the definition of an autonomous weapon system, including, for example, a pressure-activated mine or fire and forget munition, but also defensive systems. I'm going to talk about these three weapon systems or weapons throughout the next 10 minutes, but just that you know, it is in the discussion, and Andreas Bilger is going to discuss that in more detail a bit later on. But until today, it is not entirely clear among states what kind of definition is the right one. Do we favor a very broad one? Do we want to have a narrow definition? Do we want to exclude certain technologies, and so on and so forth? What you should know, or what is really important here when we talk about autonomous weapon systems, just for your own purposes, in order to understand the complexity of this issue, it is far more conducive to think of autonomy more as a spectrum. So autonomy can manifest itself on various different levels and on various different also military echelons. What it all boils down to is it gets dangerous. It gets crucial when we talk about autonomy of a weapon system in its critical functions, that is to say, the identification of a target, and then the decision, so to say, of a machine to neutralize that target by using, for example, a missile. But autonomy can manifest itself on various other levels as well. You know that drones, for example, do have certain autonomous functions. They can, some of them at least, can self-navigate. Some of them can, for example, undertake self-refueling missions. So this is also autonomy. But when we talk about autonomy in today's military context and autonomous weapon systems, we speak of weapon systems that are technically capable of identifying and neutralizing a human or a human target or a military object without the need for further human intervention. So we don't need a human who, for example, presses literally a button or does any other kind of stuff. So there is this lack of human intervention or even human oversight. Regarding mines, just very briefly, you know that there are different types of mines. Some of them are already prohibited under international law. And I'm not going to go into details regarding the document I'm going to talk about right now. Just that you know, there is a Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. This is an international treaty which has been ratified by a number of states, and Andreas Bilger is going to talk about this in a few moments. But just that you know, states parties to this treaty meet regularly and in order to discuss a potential regulation of autonomous weapon systems. And one state is particularly active, which is the state of Palestine. So we also have, Austria is also very active in this regard, and Germany, France, and many also like the Philippines. So of course also states from across the globe, and also Palestine is very active in this regard. And just that you know, Palestine has submitted a written proposal in the GGE 2023, and here it made clear that according to the state of Palestine and according to its view, pressure-activated mines also qualify as autonomous weapon systems, because in the end, a pressure-activated mine works in the following way. It only explodes if, you know, if, for example, a normal, so to say, person steps on that mine, it won't explode. But if, for example, a very heavy military vehicle steps on that mine, it then explodes. So the mine is kind of able to differentiate, to a certain degree at least, between military objects such as vehicles, which are very heavy, which can be measured technically, and then of course also humans or other vehicles which are not military vehicles. So in the end, this would also, according to the state of Palestine, qualify as an autonomous weapon system. But other people out there, other states, but also some people in academia argue that it is not an autonomous weapon system because the so to say library of potential military targets does not change. So it can always only be a military object, a military vehicle. But if you think, for example, about an AI-enabled weapon system, an AI-enabled autonomous weapon system, such a weapon system might, by applying machine learning, be able to extend and broaden the number and the types of military objects that the weapon system would then identify and decide to neutralize. So just that you know that this is not always a view that is shared by everyone in who's involved in this process. As you can see on the right side of my slide, the United States of America in 2012 have published Regulation 3009. It was the first larger document providing a very, very comprehensive definition of autonomous weapon systems. Not everyone shared the views taken by the United States, but the United States, for example, made it very clear that mines do not qualify as autonomous weapon systems, potentially or probably because of the reasons that I have just alluded to. So just that you see there is this discussion going on that you should just be aware of in order to understand what we're talking about. The same holds true for fire and forget munition. So when you talk about identifying military targets, normally in the past, it was always necessary to have, a kind of a line of sight targeting so that you have a permanent eye contact with the potential target that you would like to neutralize. That was undertaken or achieved by using, excuse me, my email account is quite noisy, by illumination of the target or wire guidance, for example. But when you used illumination of a potential target or wire guidance of a potential target, you yourself risked of being attacked by the adversary in return. So militaries thought, well, how can we kind of get rid of the necessity to have line of sight contact to still attack our targets, but without being vulnerable? And this is when fire and forget munition comes into play. So the human operators more or less direct a certain weapon in a direction, and then the weapon system itself has any kind of guidance system. So there are various ways or various types of guidance systems, and these guidance systems can do some readjustments during flight and then navigate and detonate on the correct target they have identified. And sometimes, well, they have been, of course, built and designed to be able to differentiate between certain types of military targets also. And so because of the readjustments they are doing, some people said, well, this is an autonomous weapon system because in the end, technically speaking, it is the weapon system itself which identifies a particular target and then also makes, so to say, the decision to attack this target. The guidance systems that are usually used now in fire and forget munition are coordinates, of course, radar measurements, and infrared. On the right-hand side of my slide, you can see the Stinger fire and forget munition. So Javelins, for example, are one of these kinds, which were very famous, especially at the beginning of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. So Ukraine was equipped with these weapon systems in order to defend itself. But what you should also be aware of is that, for example, the United States in Directive 3009 emphasizes that fire and forget munition does not qualify as autonomous weapon system. Again, because in the end, the potential targets have been pre-selected by the human operator, and what the weapon system does is just to undertake some readjustments to attack the targets it is allowed to attack. So therefore, normally we wouldn't qualify fire and forget munition as an autonomous weapon system. Last but not least, we have so-called defensive systems. So there's a long discussion that has been going on for years. What is a defensive and what is an offensive system? Defensive systems are usually used to defend a state's territory. Patriot systems are very famous at the moment because Ukraine is in urgent need of more of those Patriot systems. Just did you know from the media, Patriot system was very famous for inter alia intercepting Russian so-called hypersonic Kinzhal missiles. Just that you know, we are not talking about hypersonic weapons today, but just that you know, the Kinzhal Russia claims to be hypersonic. According to experts in the field, it's actually not a real hypersonic weapon, but this is another story. But just that you know where the Patriot system is coming from. Phalanx is another United States air defense system, mainly used at sea for operations at sea. Iron Dome, classical. It is used in Israel. Mostly we have the German Mantis Nächstbereich Schutzsystem and also sentry weapons. Just very briefly about Iron Dome. So Iron Dome tries to make the impression that the entire territory of Israel is, you know, protected under this kind of umbrella, or this, as the name indicates, a dome, but actually it's not the case. So what Iron Dome does, it can more or less autonomously identify incoming missiles, yes. And normally when time is tight and when fast reactions are necessary, Iron Dome is able to then intercept those missiles itself. So there is a certain degree of autonomy in there, certainly. But according to official sources, there is always a significant degree of human oversight. So that means that humans are permanently in alert. There are in their ground control stations, and what they are actually doing is that they kind of supervise what Iron Dome is doing and when to intercept and so on and so forth. So the details are not entirely known, at least to the people I've spoken to. There are not too many details out there how Iron Dome exactly works, but just that you know there's a certain level of autonomy. Yes, it could arguably be said that it is also an autonomous weapon system, but there is a large portion of human involvement, of human oversight, and this is something that is really important that we need to be aware of. Just very briefly about sentry weapons. Sentry weapons have primarily been used in the border between South Korea and North Korea. There are certain robots, and this is a very tragical story, actually. So whenever someone tries to cross the border between North and South Korea, those sentry weapons can autonomously and automatically identify anyone who crosses that border and then shoots that person. So there is no differentiation between is this a combatant or not. There's not even an ongoing armed conflict between those states according to international law, or at least it's a frozen conflict. So as you can see, sentry weapons are hugely inhumane, and I don't know if you heard it, but there are some stories that China, for example, has developed so-called robot dogs, which are equipped with rifles, with automatic rifles. They should be used and are intended to be used in riot control so that they can, by using artificial intelligence, identify, I wouldn't say targets because we're talking about riot control, but if a riot kind of gets out of control and there are rioting demonstrators or whatever, this kind of robot dog can then, I don't know, identify someone who has already been in the radar of the police and law enforcement agencies, and then this person can be shot. Whatever the plan of China is, it sounds entirely against international law, but of course there needs to be more concrete information out there before we are going to make any assumptions or accusations in this regard. But this is also an example of a sentry weapon, and at least the US is very concerned about that because, as you can see, the geopolitical climate is very tense at the moment, and it's certainly not going to become better anytime soon. So this is something we should be aware of. I'm not going to bore you with the definition and some more details of autonomous weapon systems or the definition provided by the United States. Just that you know, this is also something that came up in the literature. The United States usually does not qualify a weapon system or better said, so when you look at the definition of an autonomous weapon system, it's a weapon system that once activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. So this very much reflects the ICRC's approach. And then it's interesting. This includes, but is not limited to, operator-supervised autonomous weapon systems that are designed to allow operators to override operation of the weapon system, but can select and engage targets without further operator input after activation. So this entire discussion of how can we ensure that a weapon system is used in the future in line with humanitarian law very much boils down to the question of when and under what circumstances should humans be able to override a decision taken by an autonomous weapon system. If you use an autonomous weapon system, for example, at sea or in the form of a submarine, overriding the decision taken by such a system might not be possible from a technical perspective, or it might be very challenging at least. In semi-autonomous weapon systems, our weapon system that once activated are intended to only engage individual targets or specific target groups that have been selected by an operator. And this is where fire and forget munition would come into play, for example. This is just very briefly a summary of the United States position. I'm not saying this is the only answer to the questions that are that have been raised, but this is just a very comprehensive document. What is important for us is that we need to differentiate, or that we need to be aware of the fact that an autonomous weapon system is not necessarily intertwined with artificial intelligence. So we have forms of autonomous weapon systems that, or we have weapon systems out there which have been used for years now, which did not work based on artificial intelligence, but which qualify arguably as autonomous weapon system. The IAI Harpy, it's an Israeli defense company, is a very important example in this regard. It is a loiter munition, so it's an unmanned air vehicle that can loiter in a certain geographical area for a certain predetermined amount of time. And once this loiter munition has identified an enemy target, in most cases it's enemy radar systems, it then can explode into, it descends and then explode into that radar, the enemy radar, so that the enemy radar can be destroyed, and that then, for example, fighter jets can better invade that country, that region, or whatever. It sounds tragical that this, but this is of course might be necessary from a military perspective. So the discussion was, is this now an autonomous weapon system? Because in the end, it identifies a target on its own based on the algorithm, but it's not really like based on machine learning, but it was enemy radar signature. It was designed and to attack. So you don't need AI to speak of an autonomous weapon system. This is what I want to make clear here. On the other hand, you also don't need an autonomous weapon system to use AI in a military context. This is just something that we should also be aware of. We need AI, or if you say need, but AI can help military planning, logistics, but also in order to identify, for example, the missing and the deceased or prisoners of war. So there's a plethora of different areas where AI can be very useful, also in a military context. When we don't speak about autonomous weapon systems, but of other areas. And in order to identify a prisoner of war or a deceased person or a shipwrecked person or whatever, it might be very helpful. So there's also this discussion going on, should we be aware or about technophobia and in general? And there are certain voices out there which say, well, AI is here, it has come to stay and is here to stay, so let's work with it. But this is another area we can discuss. Last but not least, before I'm going to wrap up my presentation, right now, and Andreas Pilger is going to talk about that, certainly about that in more detail, because he has the practical experience in this regard. But just that you know, right now, or we have this so-called two-tier approach. So how should we address and deal with the potential regulation of autonomous weapon systems? So the idea at the moment is that and this was also the idea of France, for example, but Germany was also very active in this regard. And actually the idea that we should differentiate between fully and partially autonomous weapon system has been in the room for some time now. And also the NGO Article 36 has been very vocal in this regard, even before France and Germany have submitted their working papers. Anyways, France has suggested to differentiate between fully autonomous weapon systems and partially autonomous weapon systems. So according to France, a fully autonomous weapon system would be a weapon system that can more or less extend and change the range of potential military targets it is allowed to attack. So let's say, for example, it was designed to attack certain military vehicles of the adversary forces, and then over the time it realizes that there are also enemy humans out there, enemy combatants. So by like self-learning and the application of learning mechanisms, it then extends its own range of potential targets, and this would qualify according to the possible consensus recommendations presented by France in 2021, qualify as a fully lethal autonomous weapon system. And a partially autonomous lethal weapon system would then be a weapon system that can identify and attack targets without, however, extending the range of potential targets it can use force against. This is just something that I wanted to show you. Very briefly about humanitarian law. So humanitarian law consists of at least 6 different international treaties, the 4 Geneva Conventions. You should not mix up the 4 Geneva Conventions with, for example, sometimes the term Geneva appears quite often in international law because it's such an important place to conclude treaties. There's also like the Geneva Convention for the Protection of Refugees. Here we're talking about the Geneva Conventions of 1949. They were adopted almost by consensus, and in 1977 we had 2 more additional protocols. And additional protocol 1, just that you know, that entails a number of rules of principles that need to be applied in armed conflict. The principle of distinction, the principle of precautions in attack, or the obligation to take precautions in attack, the principle of proportionality, and the requirement to review weapons. New weapons, means, and methods of warfare. Just try to be as brief as possible, just that you know. I give you one example why it's so difficult to talk about autonomous weapon systems. So an autonomous weapon system should actually be capable of differentiating between, let's say, an enemy combatant and a civilian, because the principle of distinction requires parties to an armed conflict to differentiate between the two. And normally you can identify a combatant by looking at his or her uniform. The situation gets far more complex if you talk about irregular warfare. Hamas fighters in Israel, Hamas fighters on the Gaza Strip, they don't wear uniforms. They are very often dressed like civilians. They run around in civilian areas. They hide in hospitals or in basements and whatever. How should a machine be capable of differentiating between a combatant and a civilian if there are no clear criteria that can be applied? What about the principle of proportionality? If you attack, for example, a military object and there are civilians around that military object, you need to make a measurement. The concrete and direct military advantage anticipated needs to be higher than the suffering that is imposed and that is kind of done with regard to the civilian population. How should these measurements take place if you use machine autonomy? Just very briefly, these are the things that are currently under discussion in international law. And I'm not going to talk about this slide in detail, but just that you know, there are a number of other areas that need to be discussed. We have in international law the concept of state responsibility. What if a state uses an autonomous weapon system and this weapon system goes all haywire and suddenly decides to kill all civilians instead of enemy combatants? What about international criminal law? So international criminal law is all about prosecuting individuals, not states and their responsibility under international law, but heads of state, for example, state organs, and so on and so forth. We have disciplinary law. What about the military echelons at the national level? What about state liability? So Amtshaftung, that's also regulated at the national law level, and product liability. So civil law questions might also arise. Here, I didn't want to tell you too much about international law, but what I wanted to show you is that there's a plethora of things we need to look at. And the most important thing that we need to be aware of, or 3 things we need to be aware of, we are talking about a potential regulation of autonomous weapons, yes, but we also know for a fact that there are many adversaries out there, states and non-state actors alike, which don't give anything about international law. And they will certainly make use of these weapon systems. The industry, not only in the so-called West, but the industry worldwide, is pushing tremendously to develop certain weapon systems. And we're not only talking about autonomy and AI, we're talking about swarming of drones of 500 and 2,500 different drones that can coordinate, that can be used in a coordinated manner, that can communicate with each other. We were talking about cloud computing and so on and so forth. So talking about proliferation, I would say that it's not only 5 minutes before midnight, but it certainly is midnight or one minute after it. So I know this is very like a dystopian outlook, and it aligns perfectly with the music at the beginning. So what I want to show you here is that we certainly need a regulation of autonomous weapon systems, and this is why I thank you so much. And I now give over the floor, so to say, to my dear colleague Andreas Bilgeri from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting us from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and thank you to Elisabeth for giving her introduction and the technical legal background that we always need when we come to this topic. I'm from the Austrian Foreign Ministry. I'm working here in Geneva on this topic now for more than 3 years. It has been a quite intense time. What I want to do today or in this presentation is, and I think this has been the request, to give a little bit of an oversight. What is going on? Where are we at the moment in the discussion, and what is the kind of future where we are going? It's definitely a dystopia that Elisabeth has just presented, but we still have the feeling that there is a window of opportunity. There is still some time that we can use to shape the future of warfare, which will definitely be completely changed by this new technology. It is, and Elisabeth has pointed to that, it is no questions that all militaries will acquire this technology sooner or later. It is more or less a given. But what we can do at the moment is we can give some guardrails, we can give some red lines, and we can also make sure that the IHL, as we know, or the international law in its completeness, is ready for these new challenges. And this is more or less what we are working in the Austrian ministry. This is the direction in which we are looking, and we have been very active in different fora, and this is also the kind of overview that I want to give a little bit, since I think we have many Austrians here also in the audience. I think something, maybe first, why is this technology even coming? In which direction is it going? I think one of our main concerns as in the Austrian Foreign Ministry is that, which has always been very strong in peace and security, and when it comes to international law and the rule of law in international relations, that we are weakening the current set of international law as it exists, and also that there are a lot of unintended consequences on the side when we make use of these kind of technologies. I think the biggest one, and I'm starting very big, it's that humans will lose control over the use of force. So that it's not humans who are deciding who is killed in conflict. It's actually an algorithm that uses the data sets that it has been provided with, that takes decisions on the basis of an algorithm. A human very distant from this current situation has programmed at some point in time. And coming back to the data, with a data set that has been curated by someone also a long time ago. And to some extent, it could also use machine learning and develop this into a direction that nobody actually understands due to black box problems and others. So that means that the humans who actually took the key decisions about in a moment where a machine kills a human are very, very far away from the situation. They have absolutely no control over it. And this is extremely concerning. And we just need to prevent this with some regulations and some measures simply on an international level, because they have to apply to everyone. What we are seeing is a race for speed. Speed counts in military conflict, especially in the air, but also in many other domains. And every decision, every kind of time that you can reduce in the situation of conflict is key. And there are the militaries in all over the world who are pushing for that direction, and AI is seen as the main enabler. The one problem that exists, or that we are seeing, is that law as we know it right now is made for humans. It's not intended for machines, or for it's made for humans and for states. State responsibility is also a big aspect, and it also foresees that there is a human there who takes the responsibility, the accountability, and so on. These are the challenges that we have to address, where we have to look into possible solutions and into different measures. We are usually also, I mean, if we structure the whole discussion a little bit, we are always looking into the technological aspects that are a big problem in these discussions, the so-called black box problem. We are talking about data sets, bias, and so on. And these are all the elements that we also know from other AI discussions in the Council of Europe, in the UAI Act, and also how to deal with this. The possibility is a risk-based approach, as we all know that. And how to go forward with these kind of technical problems that we are facing, like all the other AI domains as well. And then it comes to the body of international law that already exists, which is the international humanitarian law, and how to implement it with this kind of new developments that we don't know yet, and which to some extent we also cannot predict. So we are not clear in which direction technology will go in this field. But still, we need to have some guardrails that are also future-proof and that will take into account all these developments. And update or supplement or add new international rules, new international law to the existing international law to make it stronger. And then there is another subset that is also quite important, and that not many states or a certain group of states does not really agree with, which are the ethical considerations. The whole, you could call it the ethical, philosophical questions around should an algorithm be allowed to kill a human by its own decision or by its own conclusion? While there is not a strong legal basis for these kind of questions, except maybe the Martens Clause and all the questions surrounding human dignity, which is a key concept in many constitutions around the world, and also quite an interesting discussion if you go into that. There is, I think, in the public, there is a strong feeling that this should not be allowed, but also a series of countries and also diplomats are trying to push also into the ethical dimension and just make up new kind of norms about what AI should be allowed to do on the battlefield and whatnot. This was basically my introduction on the basic concepts surrounding all these ongoing discussions. I think what I also should give you is a little bit of an overview what has been done so far. People who are following the work on lethal autonomous weapon systems, as they are called usually at the moment, know that we have started work in the Convention on Conventional Weapons, which is quite an old instrument from the 1980s, which mostly has the task to limit or prohibit so-called conventional weapons, which means not weapons of mass destruction, and their effects. And it is a framework convention which works with protocols. So what many people also expect is that there should be a protocol at some point for this convention that deals specifically with autonomous weapon systems or lethal autonomous weapon systems. The discussion started in 2013, more or less, when, and that's maybe an interesting aspect, when from the special envoy of the Human Rights Council on extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions, Christoph Heinz submitted a report on autonomous weapon systems, and then the CCW took this up. And it first held some informal meetings, and then in 2016 introduced a group of governmental experts, which since then is discussing these issues and how to address them. What we are seeing is already from the forum that was chosen that this is seen as a conventional weapon, and but many delegations have forgotten that now. It is a instrument that is usually used to limit or prohibit weapon systems, and this is basically also what we should do. But there is a strong resistance still by a number of states. The discussions in this forum have now gone on for over 10 years. I mean, the informal meeting started in 2014, so we are having a 10-year anniversary now. And there has been, despite some document called the 11 Guiding Principles, there has not been much progress. So we are not very close to a possible instrument on prohibiting, limiting autonomous weapon systems at this moment, which leads to a frustration among many states, including Austria, and which also led us to take further action and to look into other options on how to promote the work on this topic, also within the CCW, of course, but also look into the additional topic. Why has there been not much progress in the CCW so far? That's easy to answer. The CCW works by consensus. So whatever we adopt has to be agreed by all of the currently 127 high contracting parties. And this also includes Russia, China, Ukraine, the United States, and a lot of other states, India, Israel. So it's quite unlikely to have consensus on some international law that prohibits or regulates autonomous weapon systems. Another aspect that I also want to underline that it is an instrument that focuses very much on the IHL aspects, the international humanitarian law, and that there are a few other aspects when it comes to autonomous weapon systems that are not dealt with in depth within the CCW. If you look into this, these are, for example, human rights law aspects. Something that also is very typical for this kind of weapons is that they will most likely also be able to be used in other contexts that are not necessarily those of conflict, where IHL not fully applies. So there's also a human rights dimension to the whole discussion. There's also, of course, always a human rights dimension in international conflict. There are issues of peace and security, issues of unintended escalation. Just imagining that two autonomous weapon systems are going against each other and using very similar algorithms, there is a certain chance that they will escalate, that they misunderstand each other, that there is a problem of intent. And we can simply stumble also into conflict somewhere in Kashmir or somewhere else, just simply because two algorithms are not very compatible in doing war with each other. Then there's the ethical concerns that I have already underlined, and everything that has to do with peace and security, human rights, and so on. And this is a little bit of a blind spot at the moment, and there's the big question on how to address this as well. So what did Austria do in recent years to give the discussions in the GGU laws somehow a new dynamic? In 2022, we did a joint statement, which was joined by a large number of states. I think it was 70, which expressed concern about the ethical, security, and legal challenges stemming from lethal autonomous weapon systems. And 1 year later, in the General Assembly in 2023, we presented a resolution which went into a very similar direction, but also tasked the Secretary General of the United Nations to submit a report for this year's General Assembly, and for this report seek the views of member states. This would mean that member states of the United Nations, which are bigger in number than the ones who are in the CCW. As I mentioned, it's 127 in the CCW. The United Nations membership is going far beyond that. It's a third more. can give their views on the issue, and it can be summarized in a report, and then we can use this outcome, the recommendations the Secretary General will come up for giving the whole discussion kind of a new dynamic. We also wanted to support this effort by a conference that took place just a few months ago on 28th and 29th and 30th of April in Vienna under the title Humanity at the Crossroads, where we drafted a chair summary from the discussions by experts and then also submitted this to the Secretary General. So we are now waiting for this report to be finished, and then we will look into its outcomes and take next steps, next decisions. What is definitely clear is that we will submit again a resolution to the General Assembly, which should again put pressure on the international discussions and in a forward-looking way, and see how we can use the current momentum to move forward and yeah, put a little bit of fire under the CCW so that it moves forward with an international instrument. Some other aspects, and something that was strongly underlined at the conference in Vienna, was that we are, and this was used by our minister, he liked this formulation very much, that we are at an Oppenheimer moment, which is a nice use of this image or this picture, because the Christopher Nolan film just has been published last year. So many people are familiar with this kind of dilemma that scientists or even politicians are having when a new technology comes around and when they lose control over its effects. And we have to be very clear about this. I think at some point the genie will be out of the bottle. This kind of technology, AI in the military, will come, it will stay, it will be used, it will have a big effect on how warfare will be done in the future. It has very different applications in all kinds of domains. It can be used for rescue missions, for reconnaissance, for logistics, for some people speak about human resources or just troop deployment. But it will also have very deadly effects. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it will have an impact on how which role humans will play in decisions over life and death and in warfare. And in this aspect, we are rather conservative, that there should always be kind of meaningful human control over decisions of life and death, or over the use of force, as is usually been pointed out. And this is the key point. Elisabeth has pointed to that already to some extent. There are differences what human control should mean. For some states, especially those who are technologically advanced in this field, the human control aspect is already fulfilled if there is some kind of human role in the whole killing cycle, if you want to call it this. For us, it means something completely different. For us, there needs to be some kind of meaningful involvement of humans when a human is killed. The exact technical requirements for this still have to be discussed, but it cannot be a nominal input. It cannot be something that we know as automation bias, where a human simply confirms whatever a computer puts in front of him. It has to be meaningful. It has to make sense, and it has to be a conscious decision. We are aware that this is difficult sometimes in situations of war, but still we need to set up these limits to before we go far beyond anything that we can even control anymore. And this is probably again this kind of Oppenheimer moment. There's also a big risk that we are entering an arms race on this issue, where states, if there is not pressure from other states, where big powers or states in a big power dynamic will just try to outdo each other when it comes to speed and on the kind of technology that they are deploying. And there are two powers in particular who are very much working into this direction. So we need to build pressure by the rest of the international community who are concerned about such an arms race, and just try to also set up limits in this regard, even if it means that you are losing a military advantage. What Elizabeth has also spoken about is the proliferation aspect. I think it's very clear that these kind of weapons will also end up in the hands of non-state actors to some extent. They will be easily deployed. This will be something that is nearly impossible to prevent, but what we can do at least is build up a strong norm against the use of these kind of weapons, which hopefully to some extent will also deter non-state actors of using them. So norm building is another aspect that we should look into. Going back maybe to the discussions in Geneva that we are currently having, there is the kind of two-tiers approach which enjoys support from many different corners in the room, from many different states. The problem is that there are different interpretations what a two-tier approach means. I mean, Elizabeth has presented the French view on this, which we as Austria would not necessarily agree because it has significant flaws when we talk about fully and partial. I think the essence of the two-tier approach is that we are talking about a set of prohibitions and regulations. So the simple acknowledgement that there are some autonomous weapon systems that need to be prohibited or that with a certain design or with certain aspects in their use need to be prohibited. You could also add some special functions that should be prohibited, like in situ learning, which means using of machine learning during the operation of our weapon systems. And in addition to this kind of prohibitions, I mean, the ICRC would also add anti-personnel autonomous weapon systems, which is highly debated, but probably would solve a lot of problems when it comes to defensive systems and the kind of systems that are very close to development, like loyal wingman systems within the air forces of different militaries. And the second set is the regulation part, and there, at least in our view, but we are in a big group of countries, there would be, what would be needed would be limitations on how these weapons would be used that would allow human control in a meaningful way. So we are just limiting the area in which it is operated. It would limit a few other things. It would also set up certain rules under which it would need reconfirmation. It would probably also set up some abortion rules. So there's a lot that we can do in this aspect that is not going too far into the military effectiveness of the systems, but will help commanders and militaries in the field to actually have human control, but also to comply with international humanitarian law, which they have to do anyway. And one further comment, I see already Hannes popping up, so I guess I have to stop. One problem is that what will happen to some extent is that we will equip soldiers in the field with weapons that they don't understand, which they cannot understand because it's a black box where they don't really know how they work, what they will do. And this goes just simply, not only IHL, but also military effectiveness. I mean, you cannot use a weapon that you cannot predict. It is also from a military point of view, it's really not very serious, and especially going beyond international law. There's much more to talk about on this topic, and I could probably go on for another half an hour, but I will stop here. I think one last point that I want to make is, and a development that we are only aware of since a few months or since a year, but which could have been predicted, is that AI generally is very concerning in the military use, especially when it is blurring the line between reconnaissance, between target systems and command and control. So when certain roles that traditionally have been taken over by commanders are replaced by automated systems, by algorithms, by software, and if we don't know anymore what has been just a matter of analysis of the battlefield and what has been a decision on the battlefield, then we are really in troubled water, and then we are having a big problem on how the means and methods of war are developing in the future. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
Great. like to thank both speakers for excellent presentations that I know will provoke many questions. I can happily ask the first question, but I don't want to take it away from someone else. So let me see if there are any questions. Some in the chat. Okay. I guess I will ask, just make a couple comments. Paul's here too, so I'll make it quick. It sounds like there's agreement between both of you that there should be restrictions on machine ability to pull the trigger on lethal force. We don't want machines being able to do that. We want humans to oversee that process. I wanted to be sure I understood you both correctly on that point, because we do have big examples from nuclear history and the arms race between the United States and Soviet Union, where human intervention, I'm speaking here of the incident in 1983, where there was an error alert telling Soviet command and control that there were 5 missiles coming toward the Soviet Union. And a brave Soviet military officer, Stanislav Petrov, decided to ignore launching the automatic retaliatory response, which arguably, you know, if he had not done that, we might not be sitting here today discussing this issue again. So I wanted to be sure you all agreed on that point. The second one is, I wonder what each speaker would have to say about the question of critical infrastructure and sleeper cell code placed within American critical infrastructure that can be activated in the event of heightened hostilities, whether that should be regulated in some way. I'm thinking here more simply of just, why don't we get both the US and China to pledge no first use of attacks on critical infrastructure? Because this is something that the Americans are dealing with now with the Chinese. They've done some extraordinarily clever efforts that involve human beings infiltrating GitHub and putting systems in place that they're not ready to activate them right now. But at the right moment they could, and it would have devastating consequences for critical infrastructure. So that's the second question. And the third is just for Andreas. I'm wondering what weapon you had in mind when you spoke of soldiers using weapons that they don't understand. I wondered if you could give an example of that so we could all get a clearer sense of the situation that you're discussing there. So that's my kickoff set of questions. So please feel free to address them in turn. Why don't you start, Elizabeth?
Thank you so much for your very interesting and complex questions. So regarding the role of humans and when it comes to all kinds of weapon systems, I just wanted to briefly mention, well, in order to understand the discussion better and the role humans should play in also in future military scenarios, we can also think about, for example, not only about autonomous weapon systems, but also so-called decision support systems. So when we talk about Lavender or Gospel, these are AI systems that should merely make recommendations to the human operators, which should then decide who to attack and who not to attack. And this example, both the Lavender and the Gospel, really exemplifies that even in case AI plays a so-called minor role, because humans are still in control, because they are still the ones who decide if an attack should take place or not, many things can go wrong, and from various different reasons. I think one of the reasons, one of those reasons is, of course, the issue of automation bias. So the propensity of humans to rather trust a decision that has been made by a machine. I mean, the example that you have alluded to is like the opposite. So that human intuition, certainly in that scenario, played a very important, crucial role that actually prevented a Third World War. But we also know for a fact and from recent research that the issue of automation bias, or the propensity to trust in AI systems, is something that we have already seen with regard to so-called decision support systems, which are already out there, and which might, of course, also hold true in case we talk about true so-called autonomous weapon systems. So even if we have a weapon system where humans are still able to, let's say, monitor and override a decision by a so-called autonomous weapon system, let's say an unmanned aerial vehicle based on AI that can identify military targets and differentiate them from civilian targets, it is still the fact that the humans sitting behind or sitting in the ground control station having to override a decision might be inclined to believe that weapon system. So this is something that we should, of course, be looking at. Another issue, of course, is the level of concentration humans can have and their ability to cognitively be able to understand what is actually happening with the AI system. We talk about Lavender and Gospel. We know for a fact that those people working with these systems were sometimes overwhelmed not only by the number and the amount of data that have been not only gathered, but also analyzed and transformed, but also the speed of decision-making. This, even though we have humans not only in the loop, but humans being able to override decisions, there are so many pitfalls, so many obstacles still in the way that might make a autonomous weapon system highly dangerous. So this is just something that I wanted to allude to. And just one point about the critical infrastructure, I think this is a very important point to say. These are the things that you have alluded to when talking about critical infrastructure. These are like the very extreme red lines, but I think this is absolutely correct. So the ultimate question will also be, how should we deal with states which might never agree on legally binding norms dealing and addressing autonomous weapon systems? How should we deal with them? Because actually it's them which might have the majority of those weapon systems, not only because they haven't signed up or have ratified an international treaty prohibiting those weapon systems, but also because they simply want to have this technology out there. There is this arms race certainly out there. So I think these kind of extreme red lines that you have mentioned, so the decision and the agreement not to, for example, destroy each other's critical infrastructure or something where AI comes into play, certainly makes sense. So we also need to think about how to deal with those military power players, because they will not be on board when we talk about an AI treaty or an autonomous weapon systems treaty. Yeah, thank you so much.
Andreas. Thank you, Elizabeth.
I mean, question number one about the human control aspect. I mean, this is something we are discussing very deeply, and the differences are really going into where would this human actually sit? Would it be very close? And how much control does he actually have, or she, over the system? How much involvement is there foreseen? And for some countries, this is very, very far away. I mean, you could imagine it like drones have been used in the past decades. And for others, it's supposed to be very close. It's an operator who actually has a full understanding on where this system is used, what are the surroundings, how many civilians are there or are there none, and also how the system operates, how it would probably act in this situation, and also have a full understanding of the situation. The problem is most likely this will not be the case, and this is maybe the other questions that you posed about operators that don't understand the weapons that they are operating. Yeah. I mean, the main problem here is that, I mentioned this at the beginning, it's humans who the law was made for. And one understanding that we actually have in the GGE laws, and this has been one of the earlier one, is that accountability, as it is foreseen in international law, cannot be transferred to machines. So there will be always someone who is accountable. It's always a human. And the question is who? Will it be the operator? Will it be the programmer? Will it be the politician who allowed these kind of systems to be used in the first place? We don't know that at this point in time. The other issue surrounding this is that the kind of algorithms that we are seeing there and the systems, and if you take most people, the problem is when we are discussing autonomous weapon systems, everyone has a different system in mind. I think the most common system that people have in mind would be if you just take the drones that are currently used in different conflicts and add a little bit of artificial intelligence on top. Many of them could easily acquire that ability in the near future. So if you do that, you have an algorithm that takes certain decision. You as an operator in the field, you don't know how this algorithm works. I mean, usually militaries will do thorough testing. They will test it 1,000 times to be sure that the outcome is very clear and will be very determined. But you don't have 100% certainty. And you, as the one who is responsible for the thing, probably will not understand why it malfunctions when it malfunctions. But you will be the one who has to react, who has to abort, and who will take full accountability and responsibility for this. And this is very concerning in itself. About the critical infrastructure, I think this is more of a cyber question, and I'm no cyber expert, so I don't feel like I'm someone who can actually respond to that, but that's maybe another. AI and cyber are reinforcing aspects, and it's a big dilemma and a big problem, but maybe not for today. And the fourth point I also want to touch upon is the kind of big, and someone put it into the chat, so that we make norms that or rules that will only apply to a number of states and not to our adversaries or the bad guys, or however you want to put it. There are two issues or two aspects to these questions. I mean, first of all, international law usually works with norm building. You start somewhere, you have a coalition of states who says this is important to us, we consider this international law, and then it grows. You never have treaties where everyone is on board from the very beginning. And the Anti-Personal Mine-Ban Treaty is a good example, the cluster munitions. It's a coalition of states and civil society, and we forgot to mention the role of civil society in this whole process today. And then it just goes bigger and bigger. I mean, there's a certain risk that then some people will never join, but this is actually a risk we simply have to take. Then there is a very specific aspect to autonomous weapon systems. Those are not nuclear weapons. They will not be only in the hand of the states who develop them. They will be exported. And it will not just be China, Russia, and the US who will develop these and export them. And this is something we see already in the drone technology. It is Israel, Turkey, Iran who are developing this kind of weapons, and the next country could be around the corner. It could be somewhere in Africa or somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So we are not just having the big players and the big military powers. We are having a whole sea of possible players. I mean, of course, AI is a little bit more complicated, and US will be the most advanced one, obviously. But it will not stay this way. And these weapons will be an export Schlager, we would call it in German. I mean, they will be a hit. Everyone will want to have them. Everyone will buy them. If most of the world has a strong norm and has certain rules about what these weapons should not be doing, even those countries developing them and wanting to export them will take this into account. So there's a strong buyer's force also in this whole discussion. And I will stop here because more questions are coming in.
Yes, thanks so much for those responses. Paul, then Hannes.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Very briefly, a comment and a question about just war, the just war doctrine. But briefly, the comment. I think Andreas is right. Law is made for humans, and Alison, you rightly pointed to also, for example, civil infrastructures. And actually, we are already using automatic weapons there for cyber defense that autonomously can decide how to defend against the cyber attack. And of course, this may have lethal consequences because they might, for example, switch off part of an electricity system. And indeed, we don't know how to deal with that by law. So I think there is some kind of lessons to be learned, or hopefully something interesting in the two directions, military and civil. But my question is actually about just war theory, or the just war doctrine that says that war is morally justifiable, but you have a set of criteria. And we recently had a quite interesting presentation about that by Professor Tadeo at a conference about technology and multilateralism. And I just want to ask, does that theory of just war that I guess also spills over into the moral justifiability of using autonomous weapons, does that play a role in your discussions and in your theory building, but also in the discussions in Geneva?
Andreas, is it okay if I start, or would you like to start first? Okay. Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think that the just war theory, I mean, I do have to say that I think that the just war theory plays a very important role in academia, especially when it comes to political scientists. So they really use this terminology and the concept throughout the discourse when they're doing their research on autonomous weapon systems and artificial intelligence, respectively. I do have a legal background, and just war theory is something more of like a historical thing. But nevertheless, we still see this discussion about equality and about inequalities in war, also in international law, of course, because you have made an excellent point. If you use autonomous weapon systems, and then again, if they're used based on, or if they're enabled by artificial intelligence, the discrepancy between parties to an armed conflict actually increases. If you have, for example, of course, a very powerful state using highly sophisticated technology on the one hand, and then war takes place maybe on the territory of a weaker state, which has less possibilities to defend itself or use the same level of technology with the same level of sophistication, this certainly increases discrepancies and inequalities to the detriment, I guess, to the civilian population. So this is a huge risk that needs to be taken into consideration. I think that ties in with the legal discussion about the role of the Martens Clause to a certain extent. So the Martens Clause can be found on in various articles, so to say, in the Geneva Conventions. It basically says that even in conflicts which are not covered by the Geneva Conventions, states are obliged to apply certain minimum guarantees, which are based on public conscience and based on the basic considerations of humanity. And I think this discussion about what is humane and what is inhumane also aligns with our discussion what is just and what is unjust. And I think it is unjust if we say we have a war between a powerful state on the one hand and a not so powerful state on the other hand. On the other side, we also see, of course, that these wars have taken place for years now, but I think the discrepancies and the so-called the term asymmetric warfare might also kind of be more relevant if we talk about autonomous weapon systems and artificial intelligence of the battlefields of tomorrow. Another thing that makes the entire discussion even more dangerous from an international security perspective is what will states which don't have these kind of sophisticated weapon systems do as a replacement? They can either commit more aggressive war crimes, they can more or less say, we don't care about international law at all, we just need to defend ourselves. Another thing that Andreas has already mentioned is the issue of proliferation. Because the technology we are talking about now will be accessible and cheap, it also means that also less powerful states might have the capabilities to acquire this kind of technology, including also, of course, non-state actors. And this also will lead to a certain kind of arms race, so that those less powerful can still defend themselves, which is also, in the larger context, not really the idea behind the just war theory. This is just something that my 2 cents on this, but as I said, in international law, it's more about the role of the Martens Clause, which cannot be used as a own legal obligation we can derive certain rights and obligations from, but the Martens Clause, from the perspective of international law, is used to interpret other already existing rules of international law. Yeah.
Andreas, did you want to quickly respond?
I have 2 ways of answering these questions. I'm not sure which is the right one, but I will just try both. I think the first one, I mean, we try to bring in the ethical dimension in general, and as I have tried to point out at the beginning, there is kind of a moral ethical question surrounding this. You could even call it a religious question, because should the image of God be allowed to kill other images of God? If you go really deep into religious philosophy, really back into the centuries. But the question here is that those are issues that are not exactly covered by IHL, maybe with the exception of the Martens Clause. So there is definitely some new norm and law building required here if you want to go into this direction. And there is a hole. And just everyone, if you go out on the street and you ask people, okay, you want lethal autonomous weapon systems on the battlefield, they say no. And if you ask them, it's a very subjective moral answer. It's not one based in international law. It's a moral answer. And this is something that plays a role. It has its role not only in our discussions, but also in the history of international law. We all know the images of Princess Diana going over minefields, which has then created a strong norm against anti-personnel mines, despite them being extremely useful on the battlefields. So there is this kind of aspect that in the long run is the basis of the building of international law. And the first kind of international humanitarian law that came into life, St. Petersburg Declaration, was also a very strong humanitarian effort. And it was just a feeling about this. I mean, you have to look it up in Wikipedia, otherwise I will waste some time. But it has been a humanitarian question since the very beginning, which is the case for all international humanitarian law. And this is, and I linked it up accidentally with my second answer. I mean, if we go to just wars and you're just feeling, I have to defend my country, I have to defend democracies, which is definitely something that comes up in certain countries and which is a legitimate cause. But it is very subjective, and it cannot, a subjective situation cannot lead to a future for all humankind, because this is a fundamental question, how wars are fought now in the future and also in 200 years, because we are setting the foundations, the rules now for a very long time to come. And finally, I mean, there's also this kind of thing that the public consciousness plays a big role. We know this from discussions with colleagues. If they talk about national measures, not the ones they want to have on an international rule, the national measures that countries who don't want legally binding instruments on an international level, like the US, UK, and L, that they put up on a national level are actually quite strict and take into account ethical dimension as well, because they are democracies. They cannot deploy weapons that are not accepted in their societies, because they will get into trouble, and they will get into trouble with the next elections. So there's this aspect as well. Sorry,
Thank you so much.
Yes, we are quickly running out of time. So what I think we'll do is Hannes has a question and Klaus has a question. So I'll have you each ask your question, and then you can rapidly respond quickly. So Hannes, Klaus.
Thank you. I just want to make a big note to the context, because so many Austrians left already. You know, there's now the European Championship, the match against the Netherlands, and they're very bad news for the Dutch colleagues. Austria is leading 1-0 against the Netherlands. So Anna and also Paul, with some, let's say, relationship to the Netherlands, we are leading 1-0. So this is, let's say, an observation and the reason why Austrians leave. I just have an observation which made me thinking, and by your presentation it became clear. Because when we talk about, let's say, successful things like anti-personnel mines and also atomic bombs, there we talked about physical, let's say, physical entities. And when we talk about autonomous weapons, we talk about software. We talk about, let's say, even if you say there's a new way of with AI and things like that, but we are talking about software which is very hard to regulate and to identify, let's say, to classify, to identify, and with this respect also to regulate. Is this observation correct? Because I see a very long way until we reach an agreement on the international level, leaving aside that some states might not want to follow, but this is it's other level of complexity.
Okay,
this is an observation.
And then Klaus.
Yeah.
One moral argument that is put forward in favor of the use of automatic weapon systems is that it will diminish the number of victims. I think independently of this is really true, probably it's not true, but even if this turns out to be true, it's highly problematic, because this human dignity is not only about counting the number of victims, but what is your opinion about this argument, which is put forward very often?
I'd like to ask Andreas and then Elizabeth to quickly respond.
Yes, I mean the software aspect is one of the big challenges, and it's getting us into trouble all time and time again because I mean there are different formulations to tackle this. That we say, okay, autonomy is a function, or autonomy works on a spectrum, or and all these kind of things. There's also formulations saying they are trying to grasp this by saying weapon systems that are using autonomous functions and these kind of little tricks. But in the end, this is the big problem. There's also the risk that if we go into a definition of what is an autonomous weapon systems, and there has been, Elisabeth presented the ICRC definition, that we are having some loopholes somewhere because of this kind of software aspect. But I mean, there's no good workaround for it at the moment. We just have to move forward and stuff the holes later. I guess that is the big problem. And something that Elisabeth and me both have mentioned, I mean, the big problem is that we are seeing now AI applications in target selection, in command and control, and so on, that are equally deadly. And it seems like they are probably faster to come than the others that will have the same deadly effect and the same problems than an autonomous weapon systems without being a weapon system at all. So it is definitely a big issue. You're completely right. The second about diminishing the number of victims, this is something we hear all the time. I mean, the Russians like this argument very much. The question is always how. It's a complex question because the question is how do you put it forward? Because some states are very, you could say, lazy about this. They will say by nature these weapons will be better in distinguishing between civilians and non-civilians, which in reality is one of the biggest technical problems that they have to solve, and nobody has solved it yet. I mean, we are talking about the problems of autonomous cars, but just with smoke explosions and forests and dirt and everything. I mean, nobody knows how to do and decoys and actually, I mean, countermeasures. I mean, it's a disaster. Some states say it will come automatically. That it's by nature more and more accurate weapons are better in diminishing the effects on civilians and pain and so on. There's another way of looking at this by seeing this as an affirmative obligation that you as states actually have to employ artificial intelligence as a part of the software or as a standalone software, or standalone means to look for civilians, to diminish the number of victims, that this should be something that you could do actively. The problem is states are not doing this at the moment. It's always seen as a nice side effect. But if you do this, then there's also the other problem. I mean, then you're again having machines that are telling you there are no civilians around, please go ahead. And there's no human who has checked around this, and you could have the same kind of deadly effect. So it's a very tricky question. We are skeptical about a general diminishing of number of victims. It could be that it's a side effect, but it's not intended. And we have to say time and time again, it's a legal obligation for states to protect civilians in armed conflict. So yeah, I'm not sure if this was a good answer, but it's with everything with AI, it's quite complicated, unfortunately.
Yes. And Elisabeth, last word from you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Peter.
Yes, thank you so much. Just very briefly, regarding the AI aspect, I totally agree. Just as a short reminder, I think there were some people in academia who even argued, well, let's not have an international treaty which defines autonomous weapon systems. Let's focus on the role humans play when it comes to these technologies over the use of force. So this was one way of saying don't focus on the technology, but rather focus on the role humans play over the use of force when we use this kind of technology. If that is really feasible is another story, but just that you know this was an idea. Why? Because many states also sometimes kind of politicize, like finding a definition of autonomous weapon systems. So if a state in the GGE doesn't want to move forward with the entire process, they start over and over again with the question of what is an autonomous weapon system. Apart from that, it would also be detrimental, in my point of view, to focus instead of the software on like platforms. So let's say you have a certain technology out there. Let's assume a Switchblade loitering munition is an autonomous weapon system. It would also be detrimental to focus on certain types of weapon systems which are already out there, and then they will be prohibited or regulated by any other means, because this would hamper also, like if there comes a new weapon system, and this is certainly then out there, modification of that particular treaty might be difficult. And the other issue, as far as I'm concerned, and I've also talked about this issue with several people, there are no official studies out there that really using AI would reduce the numbers of victims and the numbers of civilian casualties. What is true is that the political background for using AI was actually to reduce the numbers of dead soldiers, because the creating of a greater distance between like the battlefield and the soldiers would help, you know, limit the possibility that swathes of dead soldiers would be transported literally to the US, as it was the case in the Vietnam War. So this was the actual idea behind, let's save the soldiers and guarantee votes at the domestic level and get the next elections done in a positive way. So I think it certainly protects the lives of soldiers to a certain degree, but certainly not, as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know, not the lives of civilians. As far as I know, there are no such studies, official studies out there, which would support that argument.
Excellent. Well, please join me in thanking both our speakers for an excellent and thoughtful discussion of a critical issue. And Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alison. And thanks to the speakers. That was a fantastic panel. And since Vietnam was mentioned, I think this is also brings us to our final song. But I just as an explanation how we started, because that was the suggestion by Elisabeth for our music track today, Das Spoke Zarathustra, and I need to move it to the beginning, as it's also used in 2001: A Space Odyssey. So it's very nice to finally have that reference in the talk series, and it's definitely the right topic to make a 2001 reference. So thank you, Elisabeth, for this. But we also need to end with music as per usual, and I think it might be a bit on the nose, I know, but nonetheless, I think the question needs to be asked. Let me just bring this up. The question needs to be asked: war, what it is good for? And I think that the song by Edwin Starr has a good answer. So as Hannes said, we'll be back in fall with the lecture series, but also with the Digital Humanism Summer School, beginning of September. You have the links in the chat, and I also put a slide in the final video here. So thanks again to Elisabeth Hofberger-Pippern, Andreas Bilgeri, and Alison Stanger for the panel. I want to say also to the Foreign Ministry of Austria for pushing regulation. I think it's very important. I want to thank all of you for joining today, and see you in fall, and enjoy the summer.
Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Yeah. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Say it again, y'all. Look out. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Listen to me. I despise. 'Cause it means destruction of innocent lives. War means tears. 10,000s of mothers die when their sons go up to fight and lose their lives. I said war. Good God, y'all. What is it good for? Absolutely. Get said again. War. Lord. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Listen to me. War. It ain't nothing but a heartbreak. War. Friend only to the can't give life, it can only take it away. Oh, war! Good God, y'all. What is it good for? Absolutely. Say it again. War. Oh, Lord. What is it good for? Absolutely. Nothing. Listen to me. War. It ain't nothing but a heartbreaker. War. Friend only to the Undertaker. Please love and understand and tell me, is there no place for them today? They say we must fight to keep our freedom, but Lord knows there's got to be a better way. Oh, wow, God, y'all. What is it good for? You tell me. Say it, say it, say it, say it. Wow. Good God, now. What is it good for? Stand up beside it.
Goodbye. Thanks, everybody. See you in fall.